Well, today we're going to talk about what forgiveness is. A couple weeks ago was Easter. We celebrated the resurrection, and that because Jesus lives, we can understand that God forgives. And we have believed and hoped that God forgives, and we see that most evident in the fact that Jesus lives. So it's been one of those call and response phrases we've used in our church. God forgives, Jesus lives. It's as simple as it gets, and Jesus lives, so we know God forgives. We also shared about that idea of forgiveness is not simply this sort of let it go, don't deal with it. Last week we talked about what it's not, and that forgiveness needs a new definition in many ways. We're going to talk about that today, but we had to sort of like Old Testament, New Testament. We had to say, thou shalt not, the Old Testament commandments, before we could say, this is what the commandments really are, what Jesus tells us to do, and this is what it is about. Well, what it's not, last week we talked about, it's not condoning, it's not victimizing, it's not forgetting, it's not manipulating, and it's not momentary. It's really a way of life and a behavior that it is in a moment, but it has so much more about a character and a way of life than just simply trying to forgive somebody and get past that. So those are the things that it's not, and today we're going to highlight what it is. In church, I'm going to share some of the quotes about forgiveness collected and distributed by illustrationexchange.com. In it, it compiled these quotes about forgiveness. It's very easy to forgive others their mistakes. It takes more grit and gumption to forgive them for having witnessed your own. Chew on that one for a little bit. That was Mary Jessamine West. Forgiveness is the fragrance that the violet sheds on the heel that has crushed it. Mark Twain. Always forgive your enemies. Nothing annoys them so much. Oscar Wilde. To be a Christian means to forgive the inexcusable, because God has forgiven the inexcusable in you. C.S. Lewis. Forgiveness is not an occasional act, it is a constant attitude. Martin Luther King Jr. Forgiveness has nothing to do with absolving a criminal of his crime. It has everything to do with relieving oneself of the burden of being a victim. C.R. Strahan. When you forgive, you in no way change the past, but you sure do change the future. Give you a couple more. A happy marriage is the union of two very good forgivers. Robert Killian. Forgiveness is me giving up my right to hurt you for hurting me. Love that one. Author unknown. And lastly, forgiving is tough work. It's love's biggest risk. If you twist it into something it was never meant to be, it can make you a doormat or an insufferable manipulator. Forgiving seems almost unnatural. Our sense of fairness tells us people should pay for the wrong that they do, but forgiving is love's power to break nature's rule. So those are some things attributed to forgiveness. Now, forgiveness is a big issue, and it could be something that we talk about, and in fact we do talk about. I preach about regularly, and it is interjected in the sermons, comes out through the life of Christ, and we touch on it in many different ways. But because it's so mountainous of a topic, really something as deep as the depths of the seas, I'm going to take something today that I think can help you see forgiveness as a way of practice. How you can be empowered to forgive people because you have perspective. And that's the word we're going to gravitate on to today and flesh out a little bit, so you can, as you are in prayer and reflection about your life and the people who may have done wrong against you, you can understand how to forgive and what it is. So, first of all, that perspective we're going to identify from Luke 23, verse 24. It says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Let me say that again. Jesus says on the cross, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Now, think of that in the context of perspective. What is Jesus' perspective in that moment? In one sense, he is nailed to the cross and dying. And then on the other hand, what are the people's perspective? They're all standing around him. Now, granted, they may be at a loss because of the circumstances, and certainly the lives of not just Jesus, but other criminals or those who are considered to be criminals, Jesus suffering the death of a criminal, they're there and facing this, this terrible act of death and violence. But they're still standing, and they're going to go home, and they're going to eat their dinner, and they're going to get up the next day and go to work. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, if we talk about perspective, it seems like Jesus's perspective is pretty bleak, and the people all gathered around them are the ones who, one, enacted this violence against him, and two, don't share the same fault and blame and consequence as he is facing. A righteous person not deserving of death is dying, and the unrighteous who have condemned him to this fate are just standing around, waiting to go home. How does that help us understand forgiveness? Well, what is it that Jesus says? Is he resentful? Is he upset? He says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Now that's an interesting sentence. How is it they don't know what they do? And this is the thing. They don't really understand what they're doing because they don't understand perspective. They don't have an eternal perspective. They may not know what they're doing because they don't know who Jesus really is. Have you ever had somebody do something against you and you'd ask this question, you say, well, how am I supposed to understand their perspective when they're the ones that hurt me? But think about it. What is their perspective? Clearly, if they've done you wrong, if they've harmed you, if they've done an injustice to you, if they're not willing to share the love of God, but the suffering and the hurt of the enemy, then they don't have a right perspective. They don't understand. A mother who exploits her daughter, she does it because she doesn't understand dignity. And we might understand her perspective comes from her mother doing the same thing to her. A father who just rants and verbally assaults his children at a whim, emotionally disengaged, and yet when he presents himself, it is just with fury. A little perspective on that would to know that his father just screamed at him and took him to the shed. A neighbor takes revenge on another neighbor. She does this because she doesn't understand friendship. Her perspective is simply that she's alone and the only thing she has is her yard and her bushes and her tulips and her house and her garage. So if anything spills over into that, if you put tire tracks in her grass next to her driveway, her perspective is that you have done something that is irreversible. We know it's not, but that's her perspective. And that's the faulty perspective of the people that Jesus is talking to or speaking on behalf when he's on the cross. What about Jesus' perspective? He's on the cross and he's dying. How is it that how could he possibly forgive them or have an attitude of forgiveness in the moment of his death in front of the hands of the people who are the very people who betrayed him? What is his perspective? To do the will of the Father. Even while he's dying, he still has a greater cause of faith and perspective about eternity and about the love of God than of his own circumstances. It's as if to say on the cross, this is temporary, as difficult and as excruciating as it is, but God is eternal. God has a bigger plan for me, for this moment, and for these people that even they don't understand. And so with that in mind, I don't feel, as Jesus would lay to us later, he didn't feel as if their sin trumps God. They can't. Doesn't matter how much they harmed him. Doesn't matter how much they whipped him. Doesn't matter how much they pierced his hands. At the moment on the cross, even in that moment, as horrible as it is, and this is not to assume that forgiveness is without fear. There's great fear and trepidation. Those feelings don't go away because you You know you have to forgive somebody. You say, well, I wish if I was to forgive them, I'd just be at peace with my decision and it wouldn't be hard. And that's not true of the cross. It's in spite of that fear that Jesus still chooses to understand the perspective of God above and against the limited perspective of the people who sinned against him. Now, you will be in the middle of this, and the question that's going to be asked when you are in a situation where you can choose to forgive is, what is the perspective that you have? Do you not understand the sins of the people against you? You don't have to make excuses for it, but it will help you if you understand how lost they are, or how they're hurting, or what brought them to this moment. It'll also help to understand this question, and this is the one that comes right on this bridge, and it is what makes the bridge faulty or strong. Am I afraid so much that I am putting this temporary moment, what they've done to me in this one instance or in these earthly circumstances, do I hold that against them in a way that I can't let it go? In other words, my perspective is limited too. I don't see things as God sees them. I cannot overcome my anger, my fear, my resentment to love, to forgive, to let go. There it is. See, the power of forgiveness, if you want to know if you are successful in doing it, is not that it makes life perfect, but it does allow you freedom. It doesn't justify what people do against you, but it does give you the opportunity to say, that person and what they did does not control me. It is not more important to me than God's will for my life. Dr. Mitchell Dillon on Illustration Exchange says, true forgiveness is only possible with God. Even when an offense has taken place between two people, and only those two people, it is still God who requires justice. Not only that, every transgression has been paid for, not by our apologies or penalties, but the sacrifice of Jesus. This being so, how can there be meaningful reconciliation that doesn't involve God? It is by God's authority and permission that we forgive and are forgiven. I think of the parable of the unmerciful servant, forgiven by his master, millions of dollars, and then unmerciful with someone for thousands of dollars. And Jesus says, you cannot be forgiven unless you forgive, because people who follow me are known for who I am in them as people who forgive. No. Does it give them a pass to do something to harm you? No. Does it give you perspective to understand them, and perspective to understand yourself, and perspective of God's greater plan? Yes. So how do you change your perspective? Well, prayerfully, you consider God's perspective. What is the greater picture involved? How much does he love you, and how much does he care for you, and how much does he take care of you, and how much is he going to use this moment for you, not just a moment that happened to you? And when you get to that moment and you see the sun beyond the clouds and a universe that is greater and larger and of more purpose than the blade of grass underneath your feet, you understand. We know this in Jesus' last words. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. That's his perspective. Even while he was on the cross, he knew God would receive him. No matter who harms you or what somebody does against you, God is with you. And when you're ready, you can let go of that pain. You can forgive. And you can enter into his presence. He will hold you. Amen.